In 1998, the most feared enforcer in the city lost the ultimate wager. To save his empire, he was forced to marry a woman his rivals viewed as a joke, a quiet baker they cruelly labeled the least desirable. Everyone expected a public humiliation. They thought he was the predator and she was the pawn. But as the shadows closed in, the gangster made a shocking discovery. He hadn't married a victim. He had partnered with a queen who knew exactly where the bodies were buried, and she was ready to help him burn the city to the ground. The rain in London during November of 1998 didn't just fall. It inhabited the city like a grey, suffocating ghost. It clung to the brickwork of the old tenements and turned the Thames into a churning slurry of secrets and cold regret. Julian Vane sat in the back of a basement club where the air was thick enough to chew, a cocktail of cheap gin, expensive cigars, and the metallic tang of fear. He was 32 years old, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite, and eyes that had seen too many men beg for things they didn't deserve. He was the man the North London firm sent when they wanted a message delivered without a word being spoken. Across the table sat Silas Thorne. Silas was a man who smelled of imported cologne and old money, but his soul was as rotted as a week-old corpse. They had been playing for 5 hours. The pile of chips between them represented more than just currency. It represented territory, pride, and the fragile peace between their respective organizations. Julian felt the weight of his tailored wool coat against his shoulders, the concealed holster tucked beneath his left arm a familiar, comforting pressure. He was a man of logic and cold calculation, but tonight the cards had been whispering lies. When Silas laid down the royal flush, the silence in the room became absolute. The only sound was the rhythmic drip of a leaking pipe somewhere in the darkness. Julian didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply watched as Silas leaned back, a predatory grin stretching across his sallow face. Julian had lost. He had lost the money. He had lost the respect of the men standing in the shadows, and he had lost the leverage he'd spent 10 years building. "I don't want your money, Julian," Silas said, his voice a gravelly whisper that carried the weight of a death sentence. "And I don't want your car or your flat in Chelsea. We've grown bored of the usual debts." Julian leaned forward, the light from the single bulb overhead catching the sharp angles of his jaw. "Then what do you want, Silas? Get to the point before the sun decides to show up." Silas signaled to one of his associates, who produced a folder. Inside were photographs, surveillance shots of various women across the city. They were images of people who lived quiet, unremarkable lives. "You think you're a god among men, Julian. You walk through the East End like you own the very air we breathe. You're handsome, you're rich, and you're terrifying. But I want to see you humbled. I want a wager of pride." The terms were laid out with a cruel, surgical precision. Julian was to marry a woman of Silas's choosing, a woman Silas deemed the least desirable in the district. He had to remain married to her for 1 full year. If he succeeded, the debt was cleared, and his reputation remained intact. If he failed, if he walked away or humiliated her publicly before the year was up, he would surrender every asset he owned and leave London with nothing but the clothes on his back. "Her name is Beatrice Holloway," Silas said, sliding a final photograph across the scarred mahogany table. Julian looked down. The woman in the photo wasn't a socialite or a model. She was a woman of significant size, her face dusted with flour, caught in a candid moment outside a small bakery. Her hair was a wild nest of auburn curls, and her eyes held a weariness that mirrored the London sky. She looked soft where Julian was hard. She looked kind where Julian was cruel. To Silas and his inner circle she was a joke, a prop for a long-form humiliation. 1 year, Julian repeated, his voice devoid of emotion. 1 year, Silas confirmed. "And Julian, we'll be watching. If you don't treat her like a queen in public, the deal is off." Julian stood up, straightening his tie. He felt a cold, simmering rage in his gut, but he also felt something else, a strange, perverse curiosity. He left the club and stepped into the biting wind of the early morning. It was Tuesday, the 14th of November, 1998. He didn't go home to sleep. Instead, he drove his black sedan through the winding streets until he found the address Silas had provided. The bakery was called the Golden Crust. It was nestled between a dry cleaner and a shuttered pub. Even through the rain, Julian could smell the scent of warming yeast and cinnamon. It was a smell that didn't belong in his world. He sat in his car for a long time, watching the yellow light flicker on inside the shop. Finally, he stepped out. The bell above the door chimed with a cheerful, mocking sound as he entered. The heat inside was immediate, wrapping around him like a heavy blanket. Standing behind the counter was Beatrice. She was larger than she had appeared in the photo, dressed in a simple denim apron over a floral dress. Her skin was pale and clear, and as she looked up, Julian felt a jolt of something he couldn't name. It wasn't the disgust Silas had expected him to feel. It was a recognition of a different kind of strength. "We aren't open for another 30 minutes, she said, her voice rich and steady. She didn't look intimidated by the man in the 1,000-pound suit with the cold eyes. She looked like she had seen her fair share of trouble and had learned how to bake it into something sweet. Julian walked to the counter, his movements slow and deliberate. He could see the pulse jumping in her neck, the only sign that he made her nervous. He reached out, his gloved hand resting on the glass display case filled with tarts and loaves. "I'm not here for the bread, Beatrice," Julian said, his voice low and intimate, cutting through the silence of the shop. She narrowed her eyes, wiping her hands on her apron. "Then you're lost. This isn't the kind of place a man like you visits by accident." "I never do anything by accident," Julian replied. He took a step closer, the scent of her, vanilla, sweat, and something earthy, filling his lungs. It was an intoxicating contrast to the smoke of the Soho basement. He looked at her, really looked at her, noting the way her curls escaped her hair tie and the fullness of her lips. He knew what he had to do. He had to play the part of the smitten suitor, to weave a web of lies so thick she would never see the trap until it was too late. But as he stood there watching the way she held her ground, a flicker of genuine interest stirred beneath his ribs. This wasn't going to be the simple game Silas had imagined. "My name is Julian Vane," he said, extending a hand, "and I think you and I have a great deal to discuss." Beatrice looked at his hand, then back up at his face. The suspicion in her eyes was sharp enough to draw blood. She didn't take his hand. Instead, she leaned against the counter, crossing her arms over her chest. The tension between them was thick, a physical weight in the small, warm room. Julian felt a sudden, sharp desire to see what lay beneath that defensive exterior, to see if he could break through the walls she had clearly built around herself. The game had begun, but the rules were already starting to blur in the steam of the London morning. The fog that rolled off the Thames on the 22nd of November, 1998, was a thick, pea soup yellow. It swallowed the street lamps and muffled the sounds of the city, turning London into a labyrinth of shadows. Julian Vane stood across the street from the Golden Crust, leaning against his black sedan. He was a man accustomed to the hunt, to the slow, methodical tracking of a mark. But as he watched Beatrice Holloway through the steamed-up windows of her shop, he felt a strange, unsettling vibration in his chest. This was supposed to be a transaction, a necessary humiliation to clear a debt. Instead, it was becoming a study in resilience. Over the past 8 days, Julian had been a constant presence. He had sent bouquets of lilies that cost more than Beatrice's monthly rent, and stood in line for her sourdough bread every morning, despite his lack of appetite. He was playing the part of a man struck by lightning, a wealthy rogue captivated by a woman of the earth. To the associates Silas Thorne had sent to linger on the street corners, Julian was a master of the long con. But inside the shop, the air was different. Julian checked the gold watch on his wrist. It was late afternoon, and the sun had long since surrendered to the gloom. He pushed off the car and crossed the street, the bell above the door announcing his arrival. The shop was empty of customers, the cooling racks filled with the remnants of the day's labor. Beatrice was at the back, her muscular arms dusted with flour as she kneaded a massive mound of dough. Her face was flushed from the heat of the ovens, and a single bead of sweat traced a path from her temple to her jaw. "So you're persistent, I'll give you that," she said without looking up. Her voice was like velvet over gravel, steady and unimpressed. "Persistence is a virtue where I come from," Julian replied, his voice dropping to that low, resonant frequency that usually made people look at their feet. He didn't stop at the counter this time. He walked around it, entering her workspace. The scent of yeast and warm sugar was overwhelming, mingling with the subtle, peppery scent of her skin. Beatrice stopped kneading and turned to face him, wiping her hands on her stained apron. She was nearly as tall as he was, her presence filling the small kitchen. "Where you come from, Mr. Vane? People usually want something, and they don't buy £500 worth of lilies just because they like the smell." Julian took a step closer, his eyes scanning her face. He noticed the tiny freckles across the bridge of her nose and the way her auburn hair was escaping its pins in a chaotic, beautiful mess. "I want you to have dinner with me, away from the flour and the ovens." "I have 200 loaves to prep for tomorrow," she countered, though her breathing had hitched slightly. "They can wait," Julian whispered. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the soft, warm skin of her forearm. The contact was electric. Her skin was incredibly soft, a stark contrast to the rough, calloused hands of the men he dealt with daily. He felt her pulse jump under his touch, a frantic little bird trapped beneath her skin. "One dinner, Beatrice, just to prove I'm not as dangerous as I look." A slow, knowing smile spread across her lips, a smile that made Julian's heart skip a beat. "Oh, I think you're exactly as dangerous as you look, Julian. Maybe more. But I'm hungry, and I haven't been to a proper restaurant in 3 years." They walked through the fog toward a small, dimly lit bistro 3 blocks away. Julian didn't take her to the flashy places in Mayfair where he was known. He chose a spot with dark wood, heavy curtains, and an air of quiet intimacy. As they walked, he placed a hand on the small of her back, guiding her through the uneven cobblestones. He could feel the generous curve of her hip, the solid, real weight of her body through her coat. It wasn't the fragile, skeletal frame of the women Silas usually surrounded himself with. Beatrice felt like life itself, vibrant, warm, and unapologetic. Inside the bistro, tucked into a velvet booth, the world outside ceased to exist. Julian watched her as she navigated the menu with an intelligence that surprised him. She didn't order a salad or try to hide her appetite. She spoke of the chemistry of baking, of the history of the East End, and of her father, who had died leaving her the shop and a mountain of debt. "You look at me and you see a project," she said, leaning back as the wine was poured. The candlelight danced in her dark eyes. "A man like you, with suits that cost more than my car. Why me, Julian?" Julian felt the first sharp pang of guilt. It was a foreign sensation, like a needle pricked into his skin. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. Her hand was warm, her fingers strong. He began to stroke the back of her hand with his thumb, a slow, rhythmic movement that made the air between them grow heavy with tension. "Because everyone else in this city is wearing a mask," Julian said, and for the first time in 10 years, he wasn't entirely lying. "You're the only thing that feels real to me right now." He watched the way her eyes softened, the way her lips parted just a fraction. He was winning. The hunt was progressing exactly as planned. But as he looked at her, he realized he wasn't thinking about Silas or the wager. He was thinking about the way the light caught the red in her hair. He was thinking about the heat radiating from her body, a heat that seemed to be drawing him in, melting the ice that had encased his heart for so long. As the meal progressed, the conversation turned more intimate. Beatrice spoke of her loneliness, of the way the world treated a woman of her size as if she were invisible. Julian listened, truly listened, his hand never leaving hers. He felt a sudden, violent urge to find every person who had ever made her feel small and show them exactly what a man like him was capable of. When they left the restaurant, the fog had thickened into a white wall. The walk back to her shop was slow. At one point, Beatrice stumbled on a slick patch of pavement, and Julian caught her, pulling her flush against his chest. Her body was soft and yielding against his hard, lean frame. He held her there for a second too long, his hands gripping her waist, feeling the warmth of her breath against his neck. The scent of her, now mixed with a hint of red wine, was intoxicating. "Julian," she breathed, her voice a question and an invitation all at once. He looked down at her, his face inches from hers. He could see the desire in her eyes, a raw, honest hunger that mirrored his own growing confusion. He wanted to kiss her, not because the wager demanded it, but because he needed to know if she tasted as sweet as she smelled. But just as he leaned in, His pager buzzed against his hip, a sharp, insistent reminder of the world he belonged to, the world of Silas Thorne, of blood, and of the cruel bet that had brought them together. Julian stiffened, the cold reality of the situation returning like a splash of ice water. "I should get you home," he said, his voice tightening. Beatrice blinked, the moment shattered. She stepped back, pulling her coat tighter around her. "Yes, of course. The dough won't knead itself." They walked the rest of the way in a silence that was no longer comfortable. It was charged with unspoken words and the weight of a deception that was becoming heavier by the hour. As Julian watched her disappear into the yellow light of her shop, he realized that the hunt was no longer about winning. It was about surviving the person he was becoming. The shadow of the wedding was looming in the distance, a cold grey stone church waiting to sanctify a lie that was starting to feel far too much like the truth. The fog that rolled off the Thames on the 22nd of November, 1998, was a thick, pea-soup yellow. It swallowed the street lamps and muffled the sounds of the city, turning London into a labyrinth of shadows. Julian Vane stood across the street from the Golden Crust, leaning against his black sedan. He was a man accustomed to the hunt, to the slow, methodical tracking of a mark. But as he watched Beatrice Holloway through the steamed-up windows of her shop, he felt a strange, unsettling vibration in his chest. This was supposed to be a transaction, a necessary humiliation to clear a debt. Instead, it was becoming a study in resilience. Over the past 8 days, Julian had been a constant presence. He had sent bouquets of lilies that cost more than Beatrice's monthly rent, and stood in line for her sourdough bread every morning, despite his lack of appetite. He was playing the part of a man struck by lightning, a wealthy rogue captivated by a woman of the earth. To the associates Silas Thorne had sent to linger on the street corners, Julian was a master of the long con. But inside the shop the air was different. Julian checked the gold watch on his wrist. It was late afternoon and the sun had long since surrendered to the gloom. He pushed off the car and crossed the street, the bell above the door announcing his arrival. The shop was empty of customers, the cooling racks filled with the remnants of the day's labor. Beatrice was at the back, her muscular arms dusted with flour, as she kneaded a massive mound of dough. Her face was flushed from the heat of the ovens, and a single bead of sweat traced a path from her temple to her jaw. "You're persistent. I'll give you that," she said, without looking up. Her voice was like velvet over gravel, steady and unimpressed. "Persistence is a virtue where I come from," Julian replied, his voice dropping to that low, resonant frequency that usually made people look at their feet. He didn't stop at the counter this time. He walked around it, entering her workspace. The scent of yeast and warm sugar was overwhelming, mingling with the subtle peppery scent of her skin. Beatrice stopped kneading and turned to face him, wiping her hands on her stained apron. She was nearly as tall as he was, her presence filling the small kitchen. "Where you come from, Mr. Vane, people usually want something, and they don't buy £500 worth of lilies just because they like the smell." Julian took a step closer, his eyes scanning her face. He noticed the tiny freckles across the bridge of her nose and the way her auburn hair was escaping its pins in a chaotic, beautiful mess. "I want you to have dinner with me, away from the flour and the ovens." "I have 200 loaves to prep for tomorrow," she countered, though her breathing had hitched slightly. "They can wait," Julian whispered. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the soft, warm skin of her forearm. The contact was electric. Her skin was incredibly soft, a stark contrast to the rough, calloused hands of the men he dealt with daily. He felt her pulse jump under his touch, a frantic little bird trapped beneath her skin. "One dinner, Beatrice, just to prove I'm not as dangerous as I look." A slow, knowing smile spread across her lips, a smile that made Julian's heart skip a beat. "Oh, I think you're exactly as dangerous as you look, Julian. Maybe more. But I'm hungry, and I haven't been to a proper restaurant in 3 years." They walked through the fog toward a small, dimly lit bistro 3 blocks away. Julian didn't take her to the flashy places in Mayfair where he was known. He chose a spot with dark wood, heavy curtains, and an air of quiet intimacy. As they walked, he placed a hand on the small of her back, guiding her through the uneven cobblestones. He could feel the generous curve of her hip, the solid, real weight of her body through her coat. It wasn't the fragile, skeletal frame of the women Silas usually surrounded himself with. Beatrice felt like life itself, vibrant, warm, and unapologetic. Inside the bistro, tucked into a velvet booth, the world outside ceased to exist. Julian watched her as she navigated the menu with an intelligence that surprised him. She didn't order a salad or try to hide her appetite. She spoke of the chemistry of baking, of the history of the East End, and of her father, who had died leaving her the shop and a mountain of debt. "You look at me and you see a project," she said, leaning back as the wine was poured. The candlelight danced in her dark eyes. "A man like you, with suits that cost more than my car. Why me, Julian?" Julian felt the first sharp pang of guilt. It was a foreign sensation, like a needle pricked into his skin. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. Her hand was warm, her fingers strong. He began to stroke the back of her hand with his thumb, a slow, rhythmic movement that made the air between them grow heavy with tension. "Because everyone else in this city is wearing a mask," Julian said. And for the first time in 10 years, he wasn't entirely lying. "You're the only thing that feels real to me right now." He watched the way her eyes softened, the way her lips parted just a fraction. He was winning. The hunt was progressing exactly as planned. But as he looked at her, he realized he wasn't thinking about Silas or the wager. He was thinking about the way the light caught the red in her hair. He was thinking about the heat radiating from her body, a heat that seemed to be drawing him in, melting the ice that had encased his heart for so long. As the meal progressed, the conversation turned more intimate. Beatrice spoke of her loneliness, of the way the world treated a woman of her size as if she were invisible. Julian listened, truly listened, his hand never leaving hers. He felt a sudden, violent urge to find every person who had ever made her feel small and show them exactly what a man like him was capable of. When they left the restaurant, the fog had thickened into a white wall. The walk back to her shop was slow. At one point, Beatrice stumbled on a slick patch of pavement, and Julian caught her pulling her flush against his chest. Her body was soft and yielding against his hard, lean frame. He held her there for a second too long, his hands gripping her waist, feeling the warmth of her breath against his neck. The scent of her, now mixed with a hint of red wine, was intoxicating. "Julian," she breathed, her voice a question and an invitation all at once. He looked down at her, his face inches from hers. He could see the desire in her eyes, a raw, honest hunger that mirrored his own growing confusion. He wanted to kiss her, not because the wager demanded it, but because he needed to know if she tasted as sweet as she smelled. But just as he leaned in, his pager buzzed against his hip, a sharp, insistent reminder of the world he belonged to, the world of Silas Thorne, of blood, and of the cruel bet that had brought them together. Julian stiffened, the cold reality of the situation returning like a splash of ice water. "I should get you home," he said, his voice tightening. Beatrice blinked, the moment shattered. She stepped back, pulling her coat tighter around her. "Yes, of course. The dough won't need itself." They walked the rest of the way in a silence that was no longer comfortable. It was charged with unspoken words and the weight of a deception that was becoming heavier by the hour. As Julian watched her disappear into the yellow light of her shop, he realized that the hunt was no longer about winning. It was about surviving the person he was becoming. The shadow of the wedding was looming in the distance, a cold, grey stone church waiting to sanctify a lie that was starting to feel far too much like the truth. February in London, during 1999, was a season of iron and ice. The frost didn't just sit on the windows, it seemed to penetrate the very marrow of the city's bones. In Julian Vane's Chelsea apartment, the air was warmer than it had ever been, but the shadows in the corners felt longer, darker, and more predatory. Julian stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling bathroom mirror, the steam from the shower still clinging to the glass. He used a towel to wipe a clear patch, revealing a face that looked increasingly like a stranger's. For 10 years he had been a ghost, a weapon, a man defined by his lack of attachments. Now there was a woman in his kitchen making coffee, her presence a weight he hadn't yet learned how to carry. He turned slightly, catching the reflection of his own back. The skin there was a map of his history, long jagged white lines from a belt when he was only 10 years old, a puckered circular scar from a lead pipe in Stepney, and the faint, jagged reminder of a knife wound that had nearly ended him in Southwark. These were the receipts of his life, the evidence that in his world love was a liability and mercy was a death sentence. The door opened, and Beatrice stepped in. She was wrapped in a thick, charcoal-grey robe that Julian had bought her, her auburn hair damp and smelling of sandalwood. She stopped when she saw him, her eyes travelling slowly over the landscape of his scars. "You never told me about those," she said softly. Her voice wasn't filled with pity, which Julian would have despised, but with a quiet, heavy recognition. "There's nothing to tell," Julian replied, reaching for his silk shirt. "London is a rough city, Beatrice. You know that better than most." She walked toward him, her bare feet silent on the marble floor. She didn't stop until she was inches away, the heat from her body radiating through the thin fabric of her robe. She reached out, her hand hesitant, before she pressed her palm flat against the center of his chest. Julian felt his breath catch. Her touch was solid, grounded, and intensely real. "I know what a rough city looks like," she whispered, her thumb tracing the line of a scar that disappeared beneath his ribs. "But I also know what a man who is hiding looks like." She stepped closer, her body pressing against his. The contrast was startling, his hard, corded muscle against her soft, generous curves. Julian felt a surge of something primal, a desperate need to pull her even closer, to lose himself in the safety of her skin. He wrapped his arms around her, his hands gripping the small of her back, feeling the strength in her frame. He leaned down, his face buried in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of her, until his head spun. "I'm not hiding," Julian murmured against her skin, his lips brushing the sensitive pulse point. "I'm just protecting what's mine." "And what is yours, Julian?" she asked, her hands moving up to cup his face. She forced him to look at her. "Am I yours? Or am I just another piece of the business?" Julian couldn't answer. The truth was a jagged pill he couldn't swallow. He kissed her instead, a hard, demanding kiss that tasted of coffee and desperation. He felt her respond, her fingers tangling in his hair, her body yielding to his as he backed her against the cool tiles of the wall. In that moment, the wager felt 1,000 miles away, a ghost story told by men who didn't understand the power of the woman in his arms. But the world of Silas Thorne never stayed away for long. Later that evening, while Beatrice was in the living room reading a book on historical architecture, a sharp, rhythmic pounding echoed through the heavy oak front door. It wasn't the polite knock of a neighbor. It was the insistent, aggressive strike of a man who knew he was allowed to be there. Julian stood up from his desk, his hand instinctively going to the small of his back, where his 9mm pistol sat in its holster. He glanced at Beatrice. She had gone still, her eyes fixed on the door, her face pale. "Stay here," Julian commanded, his voice returning to the cold, flat tone of the enforcer. He opened the door to find Mickey, the needle, one of the firm's most volatile collectors. Mickey was drenched in rain, his eyes wide and vibrating with a nervous energy that usually meant blood had been spilled. "The boss wants a word, Vane," Mickey spat, stepping into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. He stopped when he saw Beatrice sitting on the sofa, a slow, oily grin spread across his face. "Ah, the bride. Silas told us you'd be keeping her in a cage, but she looks quite comfortable, doesn't she?" Julian moved with a speed that left Mickey blinking. He grabbed the smaller man by the throat and slammed him against the doorframe. The sound of bone-meeting wood echoing through the flat. Julian's face was inches from Mickey's, his eyes twin voids of black rage. "Don't you ever look at her," Julian whispered, the words coming out as a low, terrifying hiss. "And don't you ever speak her name in my house. You tell Silas I'll be there when I'm ready." Mickey gasped for air, his hands clawing at Julian's iron grip. He says you're falling behind, Julian. He says the bet, it's making you soft. He wants to know if you've forgotten who you are." Julian shoved him out into the hallway and slammed the door, locking all 3 bolts with a series of sharp metallic clicks. He stood there for a moment, his chest heaving, the adrenaline singing in his veins. He felt the weight of the gun against his spine, the weight of the lies in his head, and the weight of the woman watching him from the sofa. He turned around. Beatrice was standing now. She wasn't trembling. She looked at Julian with an expression that was terrifyingly calm. "Who was that, Julian?" she asked. "Nobody," Julian replied, trying to soften his features, but he knew the mask had slipped too far. "Just someone from work." "Work doesn't involve slamming people against doors at 8 in the evening," she said. She walked toward him, her eyes scanning his face as if she were seeing him for the first time. "I knew you were involved in things, Julian. I'm not a child. I've lived in this city my whole life. I've seen the way people move when they see you on the street, but I thought our home was different." Julian reached for her, but for the first time she stepped back. The rejection stung more than any physical blow. "I have to go out," he said, his voice tightening. "There's a situation I need to handle." "Is it about me?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. "Is there something you're not telling me about why we're together?" Julian felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. The contract was sitting in Silas's safe, a death warrant for their relationship. If he told her the truth now, he would lose her. If he didn't, the firm would dismantle him, piece by piece. "I'll be back before dawn," he said, ignoring her question. He grabbed his coat and stepped out into the freezing London night, leaving her standing in the center of the beautiful, expensive cage he had built for her. He drove toward the East End, the heater in the car doing nothing to dispel the chill in his soul. He had to remind Silas who he was. He had to show them that his marriage hadn't made him soft. It had made him more dangerous, because now, for the first time in his life, he actually had something to lose. As he pulled up to the warehouse where the firm held its late-night meetings, he didn't see the man sitting in a parked van across the street. He didn't see the long-lens camera clicking away, capturing every move he made. Silas Thorne was tired of waiting for the year to end. He wanted his entertainment now, and he had already decided that a leak to the press would be the perfect way to shatter the domestic bliss Julian Vane thought he had found. The shadows were no longer just shifting, they were beginning to close in. The morning of March 12th, 1999, arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum. A thin, biting drizzle slicked the streets of Chelsea, and the wind carried the scent of wet soot and river salt. Julian Vane returned to the apartment, just as the first grey light began to bleed through the heavy velvet curtains. He was exhausted, his knuckles raw and his mind a jagged landscape of threats and counter-threats. He had spent the night reminding Silas Thorne's associates that while he might be married, his teeth were as sharp as they had ever been. He stripped off his charcoal overcoat and tossed it onto a chair, his movements heavy. The flat was silent, save for the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator. He walked toward the bedroom, his heart hammering a slow, unsteady rhythm. He found Beatrice asleep, a vision of abundance and soft lines amidst the sharp, masculine angles of his furniture. The duvet had kicked down to her waist, revealing the cream-colored silk of her nightgown. Her auburn hair was spread across the pillow like a spill of dark wine. Julian stood in the doorway for a long time, simply watching the rise and fall of her chest. In the dim light, she looked ethereal, a creature of warmth and life that he had no right to possess. He felt a sudden, sharp ache in his chest, a mixture of desire and a terrifying, soul-deep dread. He knew the clock was ticking. Every day he spent with her, the lie became a heavier stone in his pocket. He sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress sinking under his weight. Beatrice stirred, her eyes fluttering open. When she saw him, a sleepy, beautiful smile transformed her face. She reached out, her hand warm and soft as she brushed his cheek. "You're back," she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. "I'm back," Julian replied, leaning into her touch. He felt the sandpaper grit of his own stubble against her velvet palm. She sat up, the silk of her gown shifting to reveal the generous curve of her shoulder. She smelled of vanilla and the clean floral scent of the soap he had bought for her. She moved closer, her body a source of heat that pulled him in like a magnet. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling his head down to her shoulder. Julian let out a long, shaky breath, his face buried in the crook of her neck. He held her with a desperation that bordered on violence, his fingers digging into the soft flesh of her back. He wanted to merge with her, to hide inside her warmth until the world outside ceased to exist. "Julian," she breathed, her lips brushing his ear. "Talk to me, tell me what's happening." "Not now," he murmured, his voice a low growl of need. "Just Stay like this for a minute." He pulled back just enough to look at her. Her dark eyes were searching his, filled with a devotion that made him want to weep. He reached out, his thumb tracing the fullness of her lower lip. The air between them was thick, charged with a physical tension that made the hair on his arms stand up. He kissed her then, not with the calculated charm of their courtship, but with a raw, honest hunger. He felt her response in the way she arched her back, her body pressing firmly against his. His hands moved over her, rediscovering the powerful, soft landscape of her hips and the weight of her breasts beneath the silk. It was a silent conversation, a desperate attempt to communicate a truth he couldn't find the words for. For a few minutes, the shadows of Soho were held at bay by the sheer force of their connection, but the morning was relentless. The sharp snap of the mail slot echoed through the quiet apartment. Julian stiffened, the spell broken. He knew that sound. It was the sound of the daily delivery, the arrival of the news that the rest of London woke up to. Normally it was a mundane event, but today a cold finger of instinct traced a path down his spine. "I'll get it," Beatrice said, sliding out of bed before he could stop her. She grabbed her charcoal robe, tying it loosely around her waist. "Beatrice, wait," Julian said, his voice sharp. But she was already halfway to the foyer. Julian followed her, his pulse racing. He watched as she bent down and picked up the London Gazette, a tabloid known for its lurid headlines and lack of ethics. She stood there, frozen, her back to him. The silence in the hallway became absolute, a vacuum that sucked the air out of Julian's lungs. "Beatrice?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She didn't move. Her hands were trembling so violently that the paper rattled in the quiet. Slowly, she turned around. Her face was the color of ash, her eyes wide and glassy with a shock that looked like physical pain. She held the paper up. The headline was written in bold black ink that seemed to bleed across the page. "The Enforcer's Wager. London's coldest gangster marries local baker on a £3,000 bet." Below the headline was a graining photograph of them leaving the church on their wedding day, Julian's face set in a grim mask, Beatrice looking up at him with stars in her eyes. The article beneath it was a surgical demolition of their relationship. It quoted unnamed sources from within the firm, detailing the poker game in Soho, the terms of the debt, and the mocking laughter of the men who had watched Julian play the part of the devoted husband. "Is it true?" Beatrice asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of the warmth that had filled it only moments before. It was the voice of someone who had already felt the floor drop out from under them. Julian took a step toward her, his hands extended in a useless gesture of comfort. "Beatrice, listen to me. It started like that, yes, but it changed. Everything changed." "A bet," she whispered, the word sounding like a curse. "I was a debt, a way to save your pride, a joke for your friends to laugh at while you touched me." She looked down at the paper again, her eyes scanning the words that described her as the least desirable woman in the district. A single heavy tear tracked a path through the flour-dusted skin of her cheek. "I thought I was special," she said, her voice rising now, cracking with a jagged, ugly grief. "I thought you saw me. But you only saw a contract. You only saw a way to win." "It's not like that anymore," Julian shouted, his own frustration and shame boiling over. "I love you, Beatrice. I don't care about the firm. I don't care about the money." "Don't," she spat, the word hitting him like a physical blow. She threw the paper at his feet. "Don't you dare use that word. You don't know what it means. You're a predator, Julian. You found the loneliest woman in this city, and you fed her a dream just so you could keep your flat and your fast cars." She walked past him, her shoulder brushing his with a coldness that made him shiver. She went into the bedroom and slammed the door, the sound echoing through the empty apartment like a gunshot. Julian stood in the hallway, looking down at the tabloid. He saw Silas Thorne's fingerprints all over the ink. It was a masterpiece of cruelty. Silas hadn't just wanted to clear the debt, he had wanted to destroy the only piece of humanity Julian had left. He looked at the closed bedroom door. He could hear her muffled sobs from the other side, a sound that tore at his soul in a way no physical torture ever could. He realized then that he had underestimated the cost of his life. He had thought he could play the game and keep his heart separate, but the two were now inextricably linked, and the fire he had started was consuming everything he cared about. The leak was only the beginning. The firm would be expecting him to discard her now, to fulfill the final act of the humiliation. But as Julian looked at the door, his jaw tightened into a hard, dangerous line. Silas Thorne had wanted a show. Now Julian was going to give him one he would never forget. But first, he had to figure out how to face the woman whose heart he had just shattered into a million pieces. The rain continued to fall outside, a cold, indifferent witness to the wreckage of a marriage built on a lie. The dawn of March 13th, 1999, was a cold, clinical grey. It offered no warmth and no forgiveness. Julian Vane had not slept. He sat in the living room, the London Gazette still lying on the floor like a discarded weapon. His mind was a frantic loop of strategies and regrets, but for the first time in his life, he couldn't see a way to win. He had been outplayed by Silas Thorne, but more importantly, he had been exposed to the one person who made him want to be more than a shadow. He heard the bedroom door creak open. He didn't turn around. He couldn't bear to see the wreckage in Beatrice's eyes again. He heard her footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy, across the hardwood floor. She didn't go to the kitchen for coffee. She walked straight to his mahogany desk in the corner of the room. Julian heard the sound of a drawer being pulled open. His heart skipped a beat. In that drawer, beneath a stack of land deeds and false passports, sat the original copy of the wager. Silas had insisted Julian keep a signed copy as a reminder of the debt. It was a piece of high-grade parchment, embossed with the firm's seal, detailing the £3,000 bet and the one-year duration of the marital performance. "I found it," Beatrice said. Her voice wasn't trembling anymore. It was cold, sharp, and possessed a terrifyingly flat resonance. Julian finally turned. She was standing by the desk, the contract held between her fingers as if it was something diseased. She wasn't wearing her robe. She was dressed in a simple dark green wool dress that clung to her powerful frame, her hair pulled back into a tight, severe bun. The vulnerability of the previous night had vanished, replaced by a steely resolve that made Julian's blood run cold. "I tried to tell you," Julian began, his voice sounding hollow even to his own ears. "You tried to lie better," she interrupted. She walked toward him, the paper fluttering in the draft from the hallway. She stopped 3 feet away, looking down at him. "I read it twice, every word. Least desirable. 1-year duration. Asset forfeiture upon failure. You didn't just bet on me, Julian. You turned me into a line item on a ledger." "Beatrice, the day we met, I was a different man," Julian said, standing up. He tried to close the distance between them, but the look in her eyes stopped him dead. It was a look of profound, intellectual disappointment. "I didn't know you. I didn't know that you could what? Fall for the mark." She let out a short, bitter laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Do you know what the most pathetic part is, Julian? I knew. Maybe not about the bet, but I knew you were a liar from the moment you walked into my shop. I've lived in the East End my whole life. I know the smell of a man who breaks things for a living." Julian stared at her, stunned. "You knew." "I knew you were dangerous. I knew you were hiding something. But I was lonely enough to think that maybe, just maybe, a man like you could find something beautiful in a woman like me." She stepped closer now, the scent of her, no longer vanilla but something sharper like ozone before a storm, filling his senses. She reached out and grabbed the lapel of his silk shirt, her grip surprisingly strong. "But I'm not the victim in your little play, Julian, and I'm certainly not the joke Silas Thorne thinks I am." She leaned in, her face inches from his. The physical proximity was agonizing. Julian could see the fine lines of grief around her eyes, but he could also see a burning, calculated intelligence. She moved her hand from his shirt to the back of his neck, her fingers sliding into his hair. For a second, Julian thought she might kiss him, and his body responded with a traitorous surge of heat. "You think you're the only one who knows how to survive in this city?" she whispered against his lips, her breath warm and mocking. She pressed her body against his, a heavy, sensual weight that reminded him of everything he was about to lose. "My father didn't just leave me a bakery, Julian. He left me his books, He was a bookmaker for the docks for 20 years. I grew up counting numbers for men much scarier than you. Julian felt a jolt of genuine shock. He looked at her, really looked at her, and realized he had been a fool. He had seen a baker, a woman of size and sweetness, and had never bothered to look for the steel underneath. Silas had chosen her because he thought she was weak. Julian had married her because he thought he could control her. They were both wrong. "What are you saying, Beatrice?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. She pulled back, her hand dropping from his neck. She looked at the contract one last time before tearing it into 4 neat pieces and letting them fall onto the expensive rug. "I'm saying that you're going to help me," she said. "The firm thinks I'm a joke. Silas thinks he's won, but he doesn't know that I spent the last 4 months looking through your files while you were out handling situations. I know where the offshore accounts are, Julian. I know about the warehouse in Wapping that isn't on the firm's books." Julian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the March weather. "You've been spying on me?" "I've been protecting myself," she corrected, "because I knew the day would come when the lie would break. Now here is how this is going to go. You're going to go to that club in Soho. You're going to tell Silas that the marriage is stronger than ever. You're going to tell him that the leak didn't work. And then we are going to take everything from him." She walked back toward the bedroom, her gait confident and powerful. At the door she paused and looked back over her shoulder. The morning light caught the auburn fire in her hair. "And Julian?" "Yes? Don't think for 1 second that I've forgiven you. I'm doing this for the assets, because, as you said, you don't renounce money or goods in this family." She closed the door, leaving Julian alone in the center of the room. He looked at the torn pieces of the contract on the floor. He should have felt threatened. He should have been calculating his escape. But as he stood there, his heart was pounding with a strange, dark exhilaration. The shock wasn't that she knew the truth. The shock was that for the first time in his life, Julian Vane had met his match. He had married a woman on a bet, but he had ended up with a queen who was ready to go to war. The game hadn't ended with the leak. It had simply shifted to a much more dangerous board. The evening of March 14th, 1999, felt like a funeral before the first body had even dropped. The air in Soho was thick with the scent of roasted nuts and desperation, a familiar perfume for a man like Julian Vane. He stepped into the basement club, his polished Oxfords clicking against the damp stairs. The music was a low, thumping bass that vibrated in his teeth, and the smoke was a grey shroud that clung to his black wool coat. Silas Thorne was exactly where he always was, the king of a rotting hill, surrounded by 5 of his most loyal dogs. When Julian walked in, the laughter at the table didn't just stop, it evaporated. Silas looked up, his eyes narrow and glittering with a predatory amusement that didn't hide the underlying rage. "Julian," Silas said, his voice a dry rasp, "we thought you'd be at home comforting the baker. I hear the morning news was a bit indigestible." Julian didn't sit. He stood at the edge of the table, his hands relaxed at his sides, though every muscle in his body was coiled like a spring. "The news was a desperate move, Silas. A move by a man who realizes he's losing a game he thought he'd already won." "Losing?" Silas leaned forward, the light catching the gold rings on his skeletal fingers. "You're married to a woman who now knows you were paid to touch her. You're a laughingstock from Hackney to Hammersmith. The firm doesn't follow men who are the butt of a joke, Julian." "The firm follows the money," Julian replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the music. "And the money is exactly where it has always been. Under my control. My wife and I are unified. In fact, she found the article quite amusing. We celebrated our new notoriety quite extensively this morning." The lie was a masterpiece, delivered with a cold, unwavering stare. For a heartbeat, Julian saw a flicker of doubt in Silas's eyes. It was a small opening, but it was enough. Julian turned on his heel and walked out without another word, leaving the silence behind him like a ticking bomb. He knew they wouldn't let him get back to Chelsea. The ambush happened near the docks in Wapping, on a stretch of road where the street lamps had been shattered by vandals, and the only light came from the churning black surface of the Thames. Julian saw the headlights of the 2 vans in his rearview mirror before he felt the impact. They hit him from both sides, the screech of metal on metal, a high-pitched scream in the night. His sedan spun, the tires clawing for purchase on the slick cobblestones before slamming into a stack of rusted shipping containers. The airbag deployed with a deafening bang, filling the cabin with white dust and the smell of gunpowder. Julian's head snapped back, a bright flash of white light exploding behind his eyes. He struggled to breathe, his lungs burning. He reached for his door, but it was crumpled shut. He kicked the glass out, the shards slicing through his palms, and crawled out into the freezing rain. He didn't even have time to stand. A heavy boot caught him in the ribs, sending him skidding across the wet pavement. Through the haze of pain, he saw 4 figures emerging from the shadows of the vans. They weren't there to talk. They were carrying iron bars and heavy, weighted saps. "Silas says give her our regards." Mickey the Needle spat, his face twisted into a mask of frantic violence. The first blow landed on Julian's shoulder, a sickening crack that echoed through the empty wharf. He rolled, his hand searching for the pistol at his back, but it had been lost in the crash. He was a man of steel and shadow, but against 4 men with iron, he was only flesh and bone. He fought like a cornered animal, his fists finding teeth and eyes, but the numbers were too great. He felt the world beginning to grey at the edges. A blow to the temple sent him to his knees. The rain felt warm now, or perhaps it was just the blood running into his eyes. He looked up, the dark silhouettes of his executioners closing in for the final strike. Then the sound of a high-performance engine roared through the silence. A silver Mercedes-Benz, one Julian recognized with a jolt of pure shock, tore around the corner, its high beams blinding the attackers. The car didn't slow down. It veered toward the group, forcing them to scatter like rats. It skidded to a halt inches from where Julian lay, the passenger door swinging open before the tires had even stopped spinning. Beatrice Holloway didn't look like a baker. She was behind the wheel, her face set in a mask of terrifying cold focus. Standing beside the car, having jumped out from the back seat, were 2 men Julian hadn't seen in years, men who had served with Beatrice's father in the old firms of the 60s, men who still carried the weight of the docks in their shoulders. "Get in, Julian!" Beatrice screamed, her voice cutting through the roar of the wind. One of Silas's men tried to reach for the door, but the older man on the left, a mountain of a man named Arthur, stepped forward and delivered a punch that sounded like a sledgehammer hitting a side of beef. The attacker went down and didn't move. Julian scrambled into the passenger seat, his body screaming in protest. He collapsed against the leather, his breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps. Beatrice didn't wait. She slammed the car into reverse, the tires smoking, and then accelerated away from the docks, the engine screaming a defiant note into the London night. You followed me," Julian wheezed, his head lolling against the headrest. "I told you, Julian," Beatrice said, her hands tight on the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She didn't look at him. She was watching the road with a professional's eye. "I know how this city works, and I know how Silas Thorne thinks. He thinks you're alone. He thinks I'm a victim." She reached out, her hand momentarily leaving the wheel to grip Julian's blood-slicked hand. Her touch was the only thing keeping him grounded in the swirling darkness. Despite the violence, despite the blood, there was an intense, raw heat between them, a shared adrenaline that felt more intimate than any kiss they had ever shared. "Where are we going?" Julian asked, his voice fading. "To the warehouse in Wapping," she replied, a dark, dangerous smile playing on her lips. "The one that isn't on the firm's books. My father's friends have been keeping it warm for us. We're going to take what's yours, Julian, and then we're going to take what's his." As the car sped through the deserted streets of East London, Julian looked at the woman beside him. He had married her to save his skin, but as the blood soaked into his silk shirt, he realized she was the only thing that could save his soul. The firm had tried to break him, but they had only succeeded in forging a partnership that would burn the city to the ground. The retribution had begun, but the real shock was yet to come. Silas Thorne had started a fire, but he was about to find out that Beatrice Holloway was the one who knew how to handle the heat. The shadows of the Thames were behind them now, but the final confrontation was waiting in the tall, dark buildings of the Docklands, where the past and the future were about to collide in a hail of lead and cold, hard numbers. By August 20th, 1999, the heat in London had become a physical weight, thick and stagnant. The humidity clung to the glass towers of the city and the grey stone of the East End alike, making the air taste of hot asphalt and old money. In a refurbished warehouse overlooking the Thames, the atmosphere was cooled by high-end ventilation, but the tension inside remained at a boiling point. Julian Vane sat behind a desk of reclaimed oak, his silhouette framed by the shimmering light reflecting off the river. He was 33 now, but he looked like a man who had lived a dozen lifetimes. A faint silver scar traced a path across his left temple, the permanent receipt from the night in Wapping. But his eyes were no longer the cold, empty voids they once were. They were focused, grounded, and currently fixed on the man sitting across from him. Silas Thorne looked diminished. The months had not been kind to him. Since the night his enforcers failed to kill Julian, his empire had been bleeding out, one ledger entry at a time. His offshore accounts had been frozen by clerical errors. His warehouse leases had been challenged by dockland unions he thought he owned, and his most loyal men had begun to drift toward a new, more stable center of gravity. "You think you've won, Julian?" Silas asked, his voice a dry wheeze. He looked around the sleek, modern office. "You think the firm will follow a man who takes orders from a baker?" "They don't follow a man who takes orders," Julian replied, his voice a calm, resonant bass. "They follow a man who delivers results, and they follow the woman who knows where every penny of your soul is hidden." The door to the office opened, and Beatrice Vane walked in. She was dressed in a tailored suit of deep navy silk that emphasized the powerful, commanding lines of her body. Her auburn hair was styled in a sharp, modern cut, and her presence filled the room with an undeniable authority. She wasn't the woman Silas had photographed through a bakery window. She was a strategist who had spent the last 5 months dismantling his life with surgical precision. She walked to the desk and stood beside Julian, her hand resting naturally on his shoulder. Julian reached up, his fingers interlacing with hers, their wedding bands catching the late afternoon sun. The physical connection was a silent declaration of war and partnership. "The final transfer is complete, Silas," Beatrice said, her voice steady and cool. She dropped a folder onto the desk. "We now own 49% of the dockside holdings. Your board of directors has already been notified. They've decided to retire you with a modest pension, provided you leave London by midnight." Silas looked at the folder, then at the two of them. He saw the way Julian looked at her, not with the disgust Silas had predicted, but with a fierce, protective reverence. He saw the way Beatrice held herself, not as a victim of a bet, but as the architect of a new order. The joke had become the executioner. "You're monsters," Silas whispered, standing up with a shaky effort. "No," Julian said, standing to meet him. "We're just Londoners, Silas. We know the value of what the world throws away." After Silas was escorted out by 2 of Arthur's men, the silence in the office became intimate. Julian turned to Beatrice, his hands sliding to her waist, pulling her into his space. The heat between them was immediate, a familiar, grounding force. He could feel the strength in her frame, the solid reality of her against his chest. "You did it," he murmured, his forehead resting against hers. "We did it," she corrected, her hands moving up to cup his jaw, her thumbs tracing the scar on his temple. "But don't think this means I'm giving up the bakery. The sourdough business is far more honest than this." Julian laughed, a genuine sound that would have shocked the men he used to run with. He leaned down, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was slow, deep, and filled with a shared history of violence and redemption. The scent of her, now a mix of expensive perfume and the faint, lingering warmth of the ovens she refused to abandon, was his only sanctuary. They walked to the balcony, looking out over the sprawling, ancient city. The Thames flowed below them, a dark ribbon of history that had seen kings rise and fall. Julian realized then that the wager hadn't been a trap. It had been a key. It had unlocked a version of himself he hadn't known existed. He hadn't renounced his wealth or his power. He had simply found a reason to use them that didn't involve leaving a trail of bodies behind him. He looked at Beatrice, her profile sharp against the setting sun. The shock the world had expected was his humiliation. The real shock was the realization that the woman he was supposed to trick was the strongest person in London. She had saved his life, his fortune, and most importantly, his capacity to feel something other than cold rage. "What now?" Julian asked, his arm draped over her shoulders. "Now," Beatrice said, leaning into him, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the first stars were beginning to pierce the violet sky. "We run this city the right way, and then I think we go home. I have a batch of dough that needs my attention." The story of the gangster and the baker became a legend in the East End, a story whispered in pubs and back alleys about a man who bet his pride and won a kingdom. But for Julian and Beatrice, it was simpler than that. It was a story of two people who found each other in the dark and decided to build something that the rain couldn't wash away. As the 19th century drew to its final close, they stood together, the enforcer and the strategist, the wolf and the hearth, ready for whatever the next 100 years had in store for them. London was still a rough city, full of shadows and secrets, but for the first time in his life, Julian Vane wasn't afraid of the dark. Finality was not a death sentence, it was a new beginning. And as the bells of a distant cathedral struck 9 times, Julian knew that he had finally paid his last debt. He was home.